Hi everyone, it's about mid-semester in the course now, and it's about time to review what we've been talking about. We have a few concepts that we've gone over, primarily related to the start of a training project and setting up your training objectives. So I'm going to go over this material, some of the chapters and articles, of course, and anything else that's been posted by me or others is also important to review and look over. Some of those things really help cement some of these ideas and illustrate some of these ideas. So please look around in the other sources for anything that you've been provided, articles and whatnot, but I'll try to hit the majority of them in here. First of all, we started with what is training, right? So hopefully you have a good idea now that training is systematic, first of all, and it's meant to change some sort of knowledge, skill, or ability, right? And in some cases, maybe just attitudes towards certain concepts or goals of the organization. But really and truly, one of the things we want to take home here is that it's systematic and part of an overall learning environment. So through the learning material and the needs assessment material and chapters, we talk about how all of this is framed within a larger context, the organizational context or teams that individuals are in. So it's important to look at this learning atmosphere and what that encompasses, right? The climate, let's say, for training, or what management and the organizational spokespeople say about training. And the overall, when we say climate, remember we think of perceptions of the overall entity of individuals in the organization. So what does everyone think about the organization's desire to provide training, let's say? But also the learning aids that you might see in your environment, reminders of training, and then, of course, the training is part of a larger system in terms of evaluations, promotions, hiring, and firing, right? If training isn't part and parcel with that, then is it really part of the climate or goal of the organization, right? Anyway, so we also stress in these first couple chapters that organizations are dynamic and training initiatives should be responsive to different organizations and the changing nature of organizations, right? So emphasize how organizations, of course, now are more female than they used to be, more ethnically diverse, global, and of course, technologies are changing. And of course, it's up to you to think of what's next, right? When you're in the HR industry, training, selecting, developing employees, there will be future challenges or future differences that we don't foresee that you have to be ready for, right? So consider that sometimes when you go over this material, not just how you can find this information, let's say if you're thinking about needs assessment now, but what challenges you might have or what benefits and improvements we might have through technological advancements through getting this information, not just that there'll be differences in how we deliver and communicate this information. Anyways, so back to the systemization of training, right? We say the workplace training is a systematic approach to learning and development, right? Improving not just individuals, but also teams or organizations, right? And the graphics kind of emphasize this. We can change the skill of an individual. We can change how individuals work within larger teams, let's say through communication, and organizations as a whole can then be improved by training. For example, the university requires certain types of training, safety or otherwise, that not just helps individuals and teams, but really focuses on lowering organizational levels of incidents, injuries, and maybe lawsuits, right? So this systematic approach really can be summed up in four critical stages, right? Or steps. That the feedback itself is continual, right? So that whatever you learn through this training is fed back into the system, right? That the system can improve based on what happens in the end, right? That also must assess the complexity of interactions among the different components, right? So as we look at the systematic approach and the diagram of the systematic approach, think about the interconnections between these different steps and how if you don't do a proper needs assessment, your training objectives, let's say, may not be appropriate. Also important is planning those goals for success, right? Are you sure you know that the training worked, and if so, how, right? And then, of course, the larger network, right, is what we talk about. So When you look at the systematic approach to training, it sort of encompasses all of these different entities and steps, going through the needs assessment to designing those objectives, and of course, considering that plan of instruction and criteria, and then going about how to assess that and determine the validity of this training, right? And then, of course, the feedback loop. One of the most critical and first things we mentioned, because if you learn that your training is, let's say, not valid, first of all, you go back to the needs assessment step, right? But there's types of validity, right? So transfer validity, right? Is that the type of validity that goes into the organization, like generalizability? Is that problematic? Is it not generalizable to other branches of the organization, or different types of groups or entities within the organization? That'd be the intra-org validity, or maybe other organizations, right? If maybe this works in sales type organizations, but maybe not manufacturing type organizations. So that's important, right? Something like IBM has multiple types of branches and employees and all that sort of stuff, right? But going back to the earlier point, it's not just the overall embeddedness of this within the organizational system, but the relationship between these, right? So if the needs assessment isn't done well, everything downstream is sort of affected. Your plans of instruction can't really deliver something that is based on objectives that are not complete, because the needs assessment was not really done appropriately. Anyways, going through these individually, right? The needs assessment we've talked about in detail, but it's that first major step, right, where you're getting some information about the organization, and that's the steps usually that you're in about now with your training partners. The thing we like to say with this is that it's garbage in, garbage out, right? Just like statistical analyses, when you look at training endeavors, if you don't gather the appropriate information about what they're lacking or what they need to gain, then of course the training itself will not be successful. So gold standard for your authors talk about org support, org analysis, requirements, task and KSA and person analysis, sorts of steps to this. So the org support step, of course, is that connection that you're making with your team, right? Maybe whoever that contact person might be within the team and your point person within your team here on campus. Is really most of the communication, but it's really also about figuring out and determining those stakeholders to the organization, and potentially people you need to survey or look for gaps in training with. So some of the questions we ask at this stage, and if you haven't done this, it might be something to consider, that are some just suggested questions for establishing support or some sort of connectedness in terms of the goals, right, or feasibility of the training. Are they ready? Are they comfortable with the timeline? Are they okay with the types of outcomes you expect? Maybe they're just sort of learning outcomes. Do they want more behavioral outcomes? All sorts of stuff like that that's connected to the assessment that we'll get to later. Confidentiality, or we'll talk later on about governmental regulations. Things like that are important to consider. Also, who all you're talking to, right? If you miss a major entity, if you're working with, let's say, 1 year it was the Spirit League with individuals with developmental disabilities in sporting programs. If you don't survey the parents or talk to their stakeholders, you may miss a major concern, such as safety. Anyways, also, are these representatives you're communicating with, and, that branch, let's say, are they autonomous enough to incorporate this? And of course, they may not right away, but maybe to some degree, this training is actually utilized. Anyways, there's also the organization analysis, which you've probably already started as well. Trying to figure out what those goals are, the mission statements, things like that, and of course, the different levels at play in this. So definitely important to go through the organizational analysis. And really, in terms of organizational analysis, we like to stress the idea of transfer here, right? Managers should be trained, for example, and should provide the opportunity to practice learned skills and potentially mentor newly trained employees who are going to be experiencing these trainings, right? If they are better guides for people newly trained, the transfer will be higher, right? Also, trained individuals must have similar equipment to perform learned skills, right? If there's not the machines on the job site that they used in the fancy training center, what was really the point of that, right? And, things like training aids, training reminders, whether it's signs on walls, equipment, or things like that. If those are not present, the transfer is not going to happen, right? In addition to sort of legal and governmental constraints on what exactly needs to happen. So if it's mandatory reporter training or some sort of confidentiality training, those sorts of things may have guidelines provided by, the government or some agency associated with that branch of the government. And of course, there may be logistical or other reasons, such as a international pandemic, which may restrict certain delivery methods. Those sorts of things, of course, should be considered. Anyways, the next step is the requirements analysis, and I'll mention this very quickly because, basically you're looking at the tasks and the way that you will gather information related to the task that's being done, right? So developing a proper and adequate methodology, we say, for collecting your needs assessment data is importantly linked to the type of data that you get, right? So sometimes needs assessment data has been provided in some form, prior needs or a jobs analysis, most likely a job analysis, some sort of job description, manual, other training manuals, in other words, things like that. But you can also do questionnaires, you can do interviews. Right now, maybe focus groups might be best, things like that. Of course, observations would be ideal. With the task analysis here, you're looking at the task that's going to be performed, right? So here we can also think about, clusters, so KSA clusters, and then you look at sort of the relevance, importance, frequency, if you think about job analysis sorts of methodologies, right? And then how to build up from that into creating a training for those specific sorts of tasks that they'll be doing, right? We call that sometimes competency modeling if we want to look at overall things like, let's say, oral communication that various entities throughout the organization may need to utilize, right? So that's being utilized a lot, we say there, to, advocate a more holistic view of capabilities, right? And then you can argue for transfer, intra or inter-organizationally if you have these competencies that are embedded in other job descriptions in other organizations, right? And finally, there's the person analysis, right? So determining who needs to be trained, right? Sometimes you look at performance standards, passing those, not passing those, or sort of maybe, let's say, national standards or mandates for training, right? That makes it a little bit easier. And then, of course, how to best address the training needs for that population, right? So the people that you're being trained, maybe new employees, maybe old employees, may have certain ways of learning based on maybe some of those characteristics or other sort of demographic characteristics, right? And of course, there's, as we say, there are ideal learning strategies for different types of people and different types of jobs, with different demographic characteristics, right? For to know, one of the articles addresses this, looking at needs analysis, of course, looking at sort of basically the idea that there's different departments, different functions that are being surveyed when you're looking at any sort of training, right? And that basically your perceived usefulness or utility of training is going to vary based on that, right? So, basically depending on your level, role in the organization, job that you do, right, you're going to see different things as more important and more in need of training, right? And that's why Fortino argue that self-report is sort of problematic, right? It's based in these, what we say, organizational and attitudinal factors, and how those sort of dictate what you see, or if you even see training is needed, right? Definitely review those articles. We also talked about instructional design. Here we're really getting into the development of the objectives, the plan of instruction, and of course how learning takes place typically, and the typical theories associated with that, right? So we know what objectives are, right? They're these specific verb, sort of starts with a verb-related statements that sort of meet some sort of condition, let's say, for some sort of a behavior, or maybe a value or attitude change, right? So embedding those into your training is important, first of all, and then also embedding meaningful objectives that are able to be accomplished through this training and meet these sort of characteristics here as best. When you deliver these, of course, you deliver them through an overall plan, right? We call that the instructional plan or the plan of instruction. So this is how these sort of activities, lectures, whatever take place to improve these skills or attitudes, right? So some of the principles we use to sort of guide these instructional plans, right? And source out these different activities and let's say when we talk about gamification later, how we incorporate things like that is based on these learning principles that are pretty, steadfast. Providing feedback, for example. This whole clinics for educators, let's say, on how to deliver feedback to students. But also within training, that's the same thing, right? How and when. There's all sorts of theories related to that. Of course, timely feedback, right? And then certain ways of giving that. Of course, overlearning, you know what that is, doing it to repetition. And then there's all sorts of other things, such as mass versus space, and other sort of tips and tools we've learned over the years in psychology and educational psych of how to properly train and deliver training in a way that people can learn and take something away from that. And most stuff's, even sailing is, pretty chunked learning with one task at a time, right? So most things happen in that way. But we have to take into mind the people that are being trained, right? And that's what we call trainee characteristics. So first of all, are they ready to be trained, right? What is their existing state, their baseline? The pre of the pre-test, I think, is always important to gather and see where they're at. Not just, in terms of their cognitive sort of attitude or whatever, but also their motivation to learn. And that sort of comes a lot from the climate, right? The climate of the organization can really provide a lot of that information, as well as some of those demographic sorts of aspects that may come into play when you're designing these trainings. These are not to be underestimated based on who you're working with in these training environments, right? Thayer sort of echoes this in his article when he talks about how organizations are changing in terms of demographics and who's being trained. He says that, of course, workforce forces are getting older, and I don't think that's less true now than in *97. More diverse, of course it's true. I think jobs are more complex, but really more complex in that we need to have more skills, but very myopic sort of sets of skills. Organizations are definitely downsizing still, and maybe more now than ever. And jobs are being very segregated now. There's very segmented workforce, I mean to say, with maybe contractual work situations like with Uber and Lyft and things like that. Anyways, and that's causing, there's options that may be causing some of the career shifts we see, but those are happening maybe differently now than what Thayer imagined. He probably wouldn't imagine people wanting to go more into the contract work that maybe was sort of a back and forth with unionization then, or union sort of issues. Anyways, and of course the change in desire to train workers, right? At different points of time, economic ups and downs, training becomes more or less important to people. But it's not to understate these sort of motivational learning theories that underroot all of this, right? So moving past sort of our plan of instruction, there's certain learning theory that underlies or undergirds, if you will, a lot of the training that we do. And that's why I always say that training is teaching, right? There's a lot of educational theory, and I think a good training manager would probably subscribe to, let's say, learning journals. I can't name any offhand, but training journals or educational journals devoted to technologies and ideas about properly teaching people would provide any trainer, I think, a wealth of information. There's all sorts of things listed here, everything from social learning theory, which is some of the oldest theories associated with learning, to need theories, equity theories, everything from Maslowian to basic goal setting could be incorporated into training, and I think that's important to consider. And that could go with your style as a trainer too, right? There's also a bunch of different outcomes that I think different learning theories might emphasize. Training people for more intellectual sorts of jobs and tasks versus, training attitudes is a very different type of training, right? And of course different than something like a motor skill. Training something that is very physical in nature. Different sorts of theories might work best with certain outcomes. and that match might be important for you and lead to future transfer of these skills to the workplace. So when we say transfer, of course, we talked about a lot of different types of transfer earlier, but it's really the transfer to the workplace that's most important, from the training environment to the work environment, right? And those can be categorized in different ways, right? Generalization versus maintenance, of course, means carrying over to the real world versus maintaining what you've learned, right? So does it actually translate and occur in the way intended, and you actually get to practice these trained abilities? And then does that training hold over time, right? Also, the idea of adaptability versus enhancement is introduced here, which is kind of the idea of new situations versus improving on what you've learned, right? So adapting to changing environments or changing technology, let's say, like statistical programs or HR systems, versus sort of improving on the skills that you have, maybe within those same contexts. Anyway, so it's important to consider what skills, abilities, or other trained content could be transferred, what could maybe not be transferred as easily, and then in terms of maintenance, maybe what could be done in the training environment to increase that maintenance over time. And maybe there's training aids, training reminders that could be implemented that could then enhance that maintenance in some way. Anyway, some of the traditional approaches to learning. Of course, we know about lecture and discussion sorts of activities, somewhat passive, but research supports that people can learn through these, even if not learn as much as in other situations. Important is the supplemental material and activities provided to individuals in these contexts to reinforce that, right? You can also, of course, use case studies. You can use role-playing. Of course, role-playing should be used cautiously for various reasons we talk about. But with interpersonal skills where it needs to be practiced and, that sort of reflective activity is needed, I think that's useful, as well as things like problem solving or attitude change, such as with the safe zone training, right? Anyways, alternatives to lectures, they talk about things like demonstrations, guided teaching, all sorts of things like that. We usually practice some sort of jigsaw learning in class where you break up and learn a different topic and then come back and share, or redisperse yourselves in some way and share, right? Anyways, there's a variety of other methods. I think important to note is that the antiquity of some of these as they sound in the textbooks is not as true as it seems. I think through technology, things like correspondence courses and programmed instruction is kind of making a comeback. And through things like apps and other sorts of programming tools, we can sort of create learning environments and programming that reinforces us to go back into the game or program, such as Duolingo, and getting further along with the training or whatever. Anyways, there's all sorts of ways to do that. There's linear versus branching programs, based on sort of your abilities and learning, things like that. So, something like Duolingo, where you're just getting goals met, let's say, is more linear. Branching would be, let's say, if it's, reinforcing material or finding similar material. We also have simulated work settings. Of course, those can be delivered in a variety of different ways. Here we're thinking of sort of in real-world context, right? In real world and also in real-world training settings, right? So of course these are nice when they're very controllable and reproducible, because you can incorporate real-life scenarios and scripts into these. But of course, sort of when you want to simulate this, how expensive it is to simulate this, of course, is important to consider, as well as incorporating the learning principles in and above just the fancy simulation. So is there something about overlearning or some sort of social learning that you can incorporate in addition to just showing what's happening? Hopefully that makes sense. But of course, when you're simulating, if you don't have good actors or you don't have good fidelity, there's some questions there about how this would actually translate, related to the physical, psychological fidelity. Maybe you have the physical fidelity, but not the psychological, or vice versa, right? I think you can think of examples where each of those would be true. And if not, pause this and try to. Some other emerging technologies to note, I sort of shouted out apps already, but web or app-based instruction, of course, is kind of like a programmed instruction, and it's easy and accessible to most trainees, which is nice. So organizations will probably very soon have app-based training through smartphones and other devices, if many don't already. Also, intelligent tutoring systems, that sort of work you through the material, and of course, using augmented virtual reality is, I think, a great way to deliver some sorts of trainings. But expensive is not necessarily better. In the case of some of these are very hard to program, hard to sort of tailor to individual sorts of contexts or jobs. That would basically have to be almost reprogrammed in terms of the virtual reality simulation itself. And then is it worth it in the end if the goal is really something that's maybe behavioral, like sailing or something like that? Is the cost worth the added benefit? Maybe not, right? The goal here is that for every sort of training objective, there's probably some sort of method that applies here. And not just method, but also learning theory that will guide that method, or that method can incorporate or embody throughout its delivery. But some final notes, when you're thinking about building employees versus building other sorts of groups within the organization, we have certain types of trainings that are typical, such as orientations or socializations. Expat training, like we discussed, is something that's very popular for overseas business people. Learning the values, norms, expectations of another culture is very important, just like you would here. Adding on sort of the cultural component for cross-national organizations is very important there. So it's not just a socialization, it's a socialization and sort of cultural immersion. Such as something like on-the-job training is sort of a cultural immersion when you're in the job doing that task that you would be doing, right? There's all sorts of versions of that, of course. Things like apprenticeships are kind of a version of on-the-job training, as well as things like embedded trainings within the work role that you already have, as well as those others. When you're building larger entities, such as teams, it's important to consider how that training relates to what you want to improve, or your training objective, right? So, of course, something like communication versus leadership would have very different, maybe, training methodologies, and harness different learning theories to deliver that, right? Cross-training, interpositional training, and other sorts of trainings can enhance team skills, especially when they need to change jobs, like in the first or second, or at least know for a good team mental model, let's say, or that idea of what others do, what's going on, and performance expectations based on that. That mental model is best when you do some sort of interpositional training. The cross-training might be if they need to actually take their job, right? The challenge education adventure learning can do all sorts of things, right? Meet all sorts of goals. A lot of times can actually be used within, let's say, assessment centers, or as well as harness a bunch of different types of methodologies to enhance some sort of set of skills or competencies. And similar is leadership development, right? So if you're looking at individuals versus groups versus leaders, different sorts of things might be useful. And for leaders, I think something that's very popular is simulation-based sorts of methodologies. So some sort of team dynamic that they have to lead, right? We also talk about multi-rater feedback systems, right? So those are sort of rating different competencies based on who they interact with, maybe, right? And then, of course, assessment centers, which I just mentioned, where it's typically a bunch of different types of things that they're doing related to leadership, or leadership effectiveness, right? Typically potential to promote somebody, to hire somebody in the upper level, right? That sort of thing. So usually there's like a multiple hurdle system where groups are going through different activities, where the scores might promote them to the next level. Or maybe they stay together, but overall people are ranked based on their performance across the different types of activities, like simulations, then sorts of situational judgment tests or something. McCormick speaks of one of these methodologies, really the most immersive type of methodology for any sort of training. You can imagine virtual reality or sort of some sort of augmented reality being used in a leadership training, of course, with different people coming to you with problems or situations like that. In this case, it's a very physical activity based in a very important judgment call, right? It's sort of policing and when to pull the trigger, when not to pull the trigger, based on the situation going on. So behavior and sort of cognition sort of linked, and looking at sort of how that can be trained. Of course, this is a popular press sort of article, so they only go so far in depth, right? But I think we talked a little bit about how, despite the expense here, there may not be huge changes in sort of the rates of accidental shootings and things of that nature. So people are looking more towards now maybe attitude changing, in addition to this sort of cognitive decision making, behavioral response sort of situation, changing maybe the interpretation of the situation. So there they might be harnessing different learning theories to approach the same training outcome. Anyways, one question I think y'all need to be considering all the time is what makes your training engaging, right? And not just what's engaging about certain types of training, but when to actually initiate that. So we talk about simulations a lot, and those can be beneficial, but I think Baldwin highlights a time when simulations may or may not be effective, right? They're talking more about a customer service situation, but even in a customer service situation, saying the wrong thing could be detrimental, could lead to a lawsuit or loss of business or various other outcomes. So they really speak to this idea of when you train, how you, let's say, overlearn those skills or socially learn those skills. If you see positive and negative models, that results in different outcomes, right? Maybe a generalization of skills when you're presented with both, but less accurate performance by not exactly replicating the positive or correct response. So the combination of positive and negative fosters more understanding and generalizability, we say, but purely positive models or correct examples would increase your performance or reproducibility of these behaviors. So you can imagine different types of jobs where that's important to some degree, more or less. In some cases, understanding might be more important in terms of decision making. In another case, just giving the appropriate response, especially in situations where the inappropriate response might be dangerous or have some sort of negative recourse, right?